Okay, we're going to go get started. I'm Joanna Davidson. I'm co-chairing this roundtable with Carla Jones, who is the just anointed new president of the Association for Feminist Anthropology. This is what we hope is the inaugural for what we hope to be an ongoing roundtable for a periodic kind of pulse-taking on feminist anthropology. And I just want to give a brief background and introduction to how this emerged, and then we're going to really go right into our presentations and have room for discussion afterwards. So the idea for this roundtable emerged during my own stint as program chair for the AFA, through which I had this wonderful opportunity of being on the receiving end of all papers and sessions that self-identified, that considered themselves, wanted to be under the umbrella of feminist anthropology. And I was really impressed with the wide array of issues and approaches, the diversity of theoretical forays into the gender dimensions of long-standing topics of anthropological concern. But I was also looking for some kind of connective tissue, some kind of insight into what the cutting edge or the kind of emerging critical arenas might be for feminist anthropology, and that wasn't immediately apparent. And I left that position with a sort of itch to probe a bit more deeply and to proactively and collectively reflect on what feminist anthropology has been, where we see its various workings and impacts now, and then maybe what some potential future directions could be. So after having some really wonderful conversations with outgoing president of the AFA, Carla Freeman, and then incoming president, Carla Jones, and by the way, you don't have to be named Carla to be president of the AFA, so if there's someone out there who really imagines yourself being president, it's okay if you're not Carla. In this case, we were brainstorming together, and we concocted a kind of dream team of participants, all of whom said yes. So we're really delighted to have this roundtable of luminary and leading feminist anthropologists. And I just want to point out that the goal here isn't to, of course, to define what feminist anthropology is, or what it was, or what it will be. It's really to have each panelist discuss what she sees as vital in the field right now, and to identify and maybe even debate strengths and weaknesses, ongoing intellectual tensions, and maybe some unfinished work that we can all kind of take up for feminist anthropology in the future. So I'm going to pass it off to Carla Jones, who will introduce each panelist, and then each one will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion amongst the panelists, probing a little further based on the comments, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the larger audience. So thank you for coming.
Once again, thank you for coming. This is a really exciting inaugural event that we hope will be common and stimulating. I'm just going to very briefly mention the names and the affiliations of these luminaries in our field. These are all people we've read already and know personally if we're fortunate. Our first speaker today will be Professor Rayna Rapp from New York University. Our second speaker will be Inderpal Grewal from Yale University. Our third will be Carla Freeman, outgoing AFA president, who has also been associate dean of faculty and authored a book during her time as in both those positions. I just have to point that out. Lucinda Ramberg, our inaugural winner of our Michelle Rosaldo First Book Prize, and Bianca Williams of CUNY Grad Center. Oh, and sorry, Lucinda Ramberg is at Cornell. I want to also point out that Sylvia Yanagisako accepted this invitation, and many of you may have expected to see her here. Unfortunately, for personal reasons, she's not with us immediately, but we are recording this event for all kinds of posterity and virtue, and she is looking forward to participating or viewing it from afar. So thank you.
So I guess that means I go first.
I think you're on.
Great. Okay, I think that means I'm on. I don't want to be identified as a luminary. I want to be identified as a working feminist anthropologist. Let me just say that our organizers set us a daunting set of questions so big and so just huge that none of us can possibly answer them, but collectively maybe we can make some inroads into opening up a discussion. And I want to thank you so much for organizing this panel. It's really lovely, and I feel very honored to be part of this inaugural launch. So that said, one of the many, many very tough questions that was posed to us was one that says, quote, "One conundrum for feminist anthropology is the degree to which this field stands as a distinct body of work. In short, if feminist anthropology is defined by subject matter like gender, women, body, kinship, etc., and or certain theoretical, epistemological, and methodological premises, have these orientations marginalized the field?" So I guess I do speak as the dinosaur in the room, and I want to say this is a problem that goes back to the origins of what we did. That is, we needed to construct a feminist ghetto so that we could recognize ourselves, develop methodologies, think about the theoretical depth of what we were trying to do individually, collectively, in terms of the field and transforming it. And at the same time, we were acutely aware of marginalization. And so the question of where we needed to strategically try to integrate and where we needed to be inside a kind of a safe space to actually have those expert conversations amongst ourselves, that's ongoing. There is no answer to that at all. But that in a certain way, we push the boundaries, to use a felicitous phrase of Gayatri Spivak's, of strategic essentialism in making that kind of home for ourselves as a place to think about what do we need to do if we're going to actually imagine a feminist transformation of this field. I mean, we were very ambitious in ways we could never have imagined that we would all be sitting here. There would be AFA, there would have been a 25th year anniversary, there would have been a book to commemorate it, all the things that have since happened. None of that was imaginable, but the tension was there right from the get-go. And we also understood that as we started to integrate, we had to take account of the increasing understanding that many people had to develop the hard way through blood, sweat, and tears about the intersectionality of our field and how much the fact of women moving in and now becoming, after all, the majority of graduate students in anthropology doesn't speak to the rest of the intersections of all the forms of social diversity and injustice and hierarchy and stratification that continue to plague us and the field and the whole of academic life, to say nothing of the rest of the country. So all of those tensions were there and have been growing since the get-go. In my part of the forest, which I guess you would call, for purposes of this discussion, someplace between medical anthropology, the politics of reproduction, science, technology studies, and the like, I think, and also increasingly, I want to come back to this, disability studies, I think that there was always a sense of the permeability, that we were intersectional, interdisciplinary right from the get-go, and that's really, really important. I think that a lot of early concepts were put out there that were very useful and very much condensed the kind of politics of reproduction that many, many people went on to study and to try to transform the field around. There was an amazing panel this morning on the politics of reproduction in the era of Trump and Brexit, and you could just see how much new thinking was going on as well. So all of that is very, very ongoing, but certainly concepts like stratified reproduction from Shelley Collin, Karis Thompson's strategic naturalization and ontological choreography, Sarah Franklin's sly, punny biological relatives, and this morning actually sacrificial reproduction, but also thinking about so much of what hadn't yet been worked out or worked through. Liz Roberts and Lynn Morgan's reproductive governance, Marcia Inhorn's Reproscape, still ongoing. I would hope some of the work on moral pioneers and existential gaps was of some use here. But learning also so much about what the transnational was going to do to all this, how we're going to think about this, a whole other generation of younger feminist anthropologists. I'm thinking of Sharmila Rudrapa's Discounted Life, where she talks about markets in life, or Daisy Diamampo's transnational reproduction when she talks about racialized reproductive imaginaries, or more recently this morning, Donna Ann Davis was talking about the afterlife of slavery and sterilization abuse, coming to understand how those concepts are ways that we think our way through. And of course, there's also a new generation of gender-sensitive anthropologists who are not necessarily talking about gender per se, but have taken up gender, which is that question of integration versus looking just at what might appear to be a feminist topic per se. Joanna and Emma Kowal's recently edited Cryopolitics, Frozen Life in a Melting World, or Sophia Ruth's Synthetic, How Life Got Made, or Priscilla Song's Stem Cell Itineraries, science studies, which is nonetheless gender capacitated. And we're also very, very good borrowers of work by other people. So from the get-go, Dorothy Roberts on Killing the Black Body and what it meant to shadow Black families was taken on board. Loretta Ross has now put it out in a book form, but the importance of thinking about reproductive justice as a way that you condense all of the things that people have been working about and how they come together at the same time. Older topics like Barbara Katz-Rossman's The Tentative Pregnancy, or Gayatri's Strategic Essentialism, which I mentioned before, and more recently Melissa Cooper and Catherine Waldeby's Clinical Labors, in which they talk about the part of thinking about precarious labor that is owed to international reproductive labors and politics to begin with. The list goes on and on and on. And I would say that another place that anthropology per se has not done very well, but it's starting to do better, would be disability studies, which are likewise extremely gendered. Whether you think of Karen Nakamura's early stuff on deaf studies or her new stuff on transgender in Japan, or Matt Corman on masculinity in China and biomythographies of how a Chinese disability rights movement got built from the top down. All of that stuff makes me think, or Don Kulik and Jens Rydström's Loneliness and Its Opposite, which is literally about sex and disability and the ethics of engagement. All of that stuff makes me think very much about where we're going in the future. And I have very recently, thanks to a graduate student who sent me this article, been very influenced by a woman named Julie Averill-Minnick, who wrote an article called Enabling Whom? Critical Disability Studies Now, in which she basically says, she makes a case for abstracting away from debates about what is or is not disability study, and obviously by analogy I'm saying the same thing about feminist anthropology, and says instead of thinking about disability studies as what it is, let's be talking in favor of two critical practices, one of which has to do with methodology and the other has to do with archives. In terms of methodology, she is saying it matters less what you study than how you study it. That social justice always has to be at the core. Who's in the room? Which voices are you listening to? What kind of intersections are we studying here when we think about feminist anthropology by analogy with disability studies? And methodology, that we are always revising our archive to understand how much, in her case, disability was everywhere, hiding in plain sight, as gender has been for us, hiding in plain sight wherever we've gone. So that sense of intersectionality, openness, permeability, unfinished work, we're not going to be done about it, and we are always rediscovering our archives, whether we're thinking about feminist filmmakers in Afghanistan or public health advocates working on girls' education or African American mothers' movements against police violence in their neighborhoods. All of those are feminist issues, and they require a feminist methodology and a respect for our archives, and I think that's the work we all do, so I think I'm going to stop there.
Can you all hear in the back? Can you hear in the back? Yeah, they look, okay. Okay, so we need to speak up a little bit.
So my thanks first to the organizers and to the FA for inviting me. I feel a bit of an interloper, quite an interloper, because my degree is not in anthropology, and though I've had a lot of traffic with anthropology, as I might say. So my engagement with anthropology began with great dissatisfaction of being a graduate student in an English PhD, struggling against the Eurocentrism of the humanities. There was much that I found not compelling about anthropology. The feminist version back in the back in the day that orientalized and exoticized culture, that produced tradition, that produced non-Western women as oppressed subjects. I won't go into the many works and their titles that gave away that production of tradition. But post-colonial studies, the work focused on power by the Frankfurt School, Foucault, Gramsci, the men, all were bringing new sorts of fields into existence. Culture also emerged through cultural studies of the Birmingham School, teaching us about imperial feminism and why white women should listen to the rest of us. Michel Rosaldo was thinking about patriarchy in ways that the most Eurocentric feminist work in the humanities, along with the vogue of French feminism, and shout out to Gayatri for saying something there today, could not even contemplate. There was more connection across humanistic disciplines, especially with the reflexive and poetic turn in anthropology, hoping to move it away from a colonial past into something somewhat new, more critical, more about social justice. In this new engagement, ethnography became salvageable for different analysis of power, especially of gender race. Anthropology was still, however, about the nation state and area studies, divided into area studies. And paradoxically, for a field created by the work of Edward Said and others, post-colonial studies became so too. It took anthropology's focus on travel and ethnographical reflexivity and fields and critique of areas to break out of that, as representation became a critical concern, and the very concept of culture became more mobile, more contingent, more hard to grasp. Along with that mobility came the mobility of nation state, of subjects, of theories, shedding sedentarist foundational thinking. Thinking across places, sites, national boundaries has flourished, I think, within anthropology and feminist anthropology more than in any other side. And the important feminist research on anthropology has produced a method of critiquing the objective outsiderness that continues to haunt a great deal of non-feminist anthropology. The more recent turn to kind of thinking through the anthropology of race in particular ways, of finance, of NGOs, of the security state, of illiberal regimes, continues to be more interdisciplinary and situated for the most part, bringing together researchers and objects of knowledge through advocacy and community concerns, and bringing them to crisis. The turn towards anthropology of the US is similarly useful as the nation state is seen as fragmented and also imperial in the US. Work on diaspora and transnational migration has been critical here. North America, the West, is not just a space of writing, of gathering knowledge, but also to be included within all sorts of transnational networks that produce settler colonialism. There are many Souths, as one of my brilliant students, Ryan Jobson, has insisted, and the US as exceptional or as area are both insufficient, even as we pay attention, as anthropology does so well, to the multiple scales of power and inequality, to the kind of globalization of finance and the unit of the household woman. Yet there are gaps that have emerged in anthropology research that are still seen as spaces where feminist research can be ignored or limited, right? Even as though limits are important and hard to understand. Research in multiple network sites on the colonial projects of rescue and the making of the worlds of white saviors have been some key directions for feminist anthropology. The work on NGOs, economic globalization, Carla Freeman, shout out. Migration and humanitarianism have been most generative in feminist research that I have engaged with, though it seems to me that the larger problem of who gets cited remains. Anthropologists, even feminist ones, often only cite other anthropologists and often don't cite feminists from other disciplines. On the other hand, feminist theory is yet another problem, often becoming the domain of a kind of mostly Western feminist philosophy, and one that is derived from that philosophy and its universalizing claims and its habits of debate and explication that can only be explained as a kind of male ancestor worship. Reflexivity of feminist method is then an important and ongoing project here, often ignored, sometimes even by feminist research. And of course, the biggest problem is that feminists do cite non-feminists, while non-feminists do not cite feminists. Maria Domar Pereira, in her work on feminist and gender studies and its inclusion in higher education in Portugal, is really an interesting and exciting book, argues that feminist theory and research is not completely taken as proper academic knowledge. Even when there's emphasis on gender or feminism within a curricula, what people do in practices in the classroom, she does an ethnography of a classroom, is that people will split out the sum of the insights, but relegate the kind of key aspects of feminist research, which are a critique of method and discipline. They will ignore that and produce that kind of objectivity again and again, while looking at women or men or masculinity or something like that. But the kind of critique gets taken out. What she calls an epistemic splitting takes place, enabling a selective engagement with feminist work, while ignoring the feminist critiques of epistemological frameworks. This non-citation is also central to the making of fields of research of topics that hope to remain rigorous if they disavow race, gender, sexuality, or any other social aspect that might muddy this so-called ongoing production and desire for outsiderness and objectivity. As example, one might say that as we are facing a context where sexual harassment and sexual assault, along with key questions of race, religion, sexuality, are central to all sorts of politics, people will claim we can still understand the state and empire without engagement with these topics, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, patriarchy and kinship becomes relegated outside the kind of analysis of the state for the most part. How scholars can engage Trumpism without understanding the notions of kinship or capital, or perhaps Sylvia Yanagasako's work on the family firm, seems to be weak and inadequate. After outsourcing patriarchy from the US, we need to bring it back, not through a reductive version of masculine essentialism that feminist theory produced and then dismissed for the West, but as a central logic of kinship and power that feminist anthropology argued for. Theory from the South must think of these recursive practices of imperial return. Or another example, how can we understand questions of security, something that I've been doing recently, without thinking of a state shot through with sex, sexuality, colonial projects of humanitarianism that are very masculinist, and their gendered rescue projects. Or even to think about a bureaucracy without gender or family or kinship is difficult. The emergence of security studies of authoritarian power that robustly engages with gender and sexuality is necessary, right? And we've seen that in the work on saving Muslim women, Laila Abulugul's another work, saving girls, all of these projects. That saving the settler colonial state continues. The habits of comparison then have to be rethought through understanding the networks, the transnational networks that produce both comparison and incommensurability, both as well. So I will end with just saying on a wonderful t-shirt, shout out, cite black women, cite brown women, cite women, but the practice of constant rethinking of theory and method is ongoing and important. Thank you.
Wow, this is fun. Thanks to Carla and Joanna for pulling this together. Thank you to all of you for being here. This is just an incredible treat and honor, and it's exciting to imagine this is going to have a future. So I had the tremendous pleasure over the last 4 years of being on the AFA board, which gave me the privilege of being on the review committee for the inaugural Michelle Rosaldo First Book Prize. We've been now through 2 cycles of that prize. Lucinda, to my right, was the recipient of the first Michelle Rosaldo Prize. Reviewing the more than 40 books for the past 2 cycles of our new Michelle Rosaldo Prize gives a fascinating pulse of the field. Anthropologists who see themselves as feminist anthropologists and have cast their work in ways that engage and advance anthropological knowledge through a feminist frame. This led me to try to capture, when we teach courses in feminist anthropology, what do we assign? What are the theoretical building blocks? What books and articles are our canon? Do we have a canon? What kinds of epistemologies and methods and textual genres have marked the development of this field? Are feminist anthropology and feminist ethnography simply good, thoughtful, probing anthropology and ethnography that takes seriously women as subjects and power dimensions and expressions of gender and sexuality, race, subjectivity, positionality of the ethnographer? What makes this analytical frame feminist? How do we know it when we see it? One might simply say that work within anthropology that turns itself toward what my colleague Elizabeth Wilson likes to call women-y things, feminist issues classically including sexuality, gender, the body, the domestic sphere, consumption, care, intimacy, embodied experience, subjectivity, the softer underbelly of human life in contradistinction to the harder, structural, observable foci, politics, religion, law, the state, technology, science, etc. But we all know that these are false dichotomies, and that just as one can study any or all of those typically feminine spheres without a particularly feminist analytical frame, and one can, and many in this room do, bring feminist critical thought to the every hard edge and every structure. The question of what distinguishes feminist work, feminist anthropological work, and what our goals are, should we hope that we hope that we sow the seeds of our own obsolescence as a subfield? That's been a kind of perennial question. Brings me to a renewed preoccupation, the relationship between theory and ethnography itself. One of the prompts that we received really helped me think through this long-standing preoccupation on my own part. I've been both stimulated and vexed, quite honestly, by a provocative quote by Maurice Bloch, in which he distinguishes between ethnography and anthropology. He says, anthropology is about developing theories concerning the human species. The only kind of theories we can have are ultimately about the human species in general. Ethnography is a different business. It's about getting to know certain people in certain places, getting to know what makes them tick, and their own way of thinking. So these are really very, very different enterprises, unquote. Without devolving into a purely rhetorical debate, it does seem prudent to push upon Bloch's distinction. For if the specificity of ethnography by design precludes theoretical generativity and is encapsulated simply by what he called what makes local people tick in their own distinctive ways, there is another subtle but equally worrying underpinning of this bifurcation or dualism, and it is profoundly gendered. Many years ago, I was struck by the palpable division in globalization studies between the global theorists, and we all know who they are, and the local ethnography, such that the theory was devoid of any explicit interrogation of gender, and the ethnography was brimming with analyses of the fundamental role of gender in new articulations and flows of people, capital, commodities, etc. Moreover, the work itself assumed a striking gender, unsurprisingly a heavily masculinized theoretical canon, and a feminized body of, quote, illustrative, diligent, evocative ethnography. Not surprisingly, these two seemingly separate bodies of work also attain differential academic currency. This brings me to one of my favorite essays by Kathy Lutz in 1995, entitled The Gender of Theory. Lutz does a brilliant job of breaking down this frankly sexist and racist manner in which scholarly work achieves the vaunted status of theory, and the citation practices, to get to your point, that continue to valorize theoretical work above and beyond all other genres, including the ethnographic. And this is a quote from Lutz. Writing theory is celebrated as an art, as opposed to the craft of ethnography, and coded masculine. But there are some interesting twists and contradictions at work in this gendered division of labor and value. Another quote. This points to Judith Oakley. The relationship between data and theory can shift as needed, as Judith Oakley pointed out in the 1970s, where the specific is described as hard scientific objective fact, Its opposite is airy-fairy, speculation, emotional, and soft, woman's domain. In another context, on the other hand, where fact is equated with vulgar empiricism, and its opposite is theory, women are seen to be the fact gatherers and men the theoreticians. Whatever female thought may be, it is the one which is undervalued. Okay, I want to try to bring this to the present moment and another area of preoccupation of my own. I'd like to connect this two-pronged and persistent phenomenon to the growing interdisciplinary interest in affect and the rise of affect theory. So this is one among many other examples we could choose. It just happens to be one that I'm interested in at the moment. A field that I see as a rich field for feminist scholarship and anthropology generally, and also where I see troubling echoes of this earlier conundrum, even as it would seem to offer precisely the opportunity for the opposite. Why is the study of affect a critical juncture for feminist anthropology? Firstly, one could say that within the social sciences, including anthropology, what we understand to be affective life has been addressed primarily in two spheres, psychology and feminist studies of emotional labor. I think it's fair to assume most of you are familiar with much of this work, much of it focused on the service sector of the economy, where we find the heaviest concentration of affective labor exchange, in spheres where expectations for feminine, caring, attentive labor is most heavily concentrated. And by this, I refer to domestic services, sex work, occupations like nursing, teaching, waitressing, hostessing, mentoring, administrating. These are historically feminine spheres of the economy, and as we know, the process of feminization of any profession or area has also implied its devaluation. This has been an historical fact, one that no matter how much critiqued, has attained an almost ontological reality. In the 21st century economy, not only in restaurants and hotels or nursing homes and daycares, but in corporate offices and the highest administrative offices of our very own universities, if not the federal government, having a high emotional intelligence quotient, having well-developed soft skills, empathy, a calm, communicative, connective personality, patience, memory for detail, persistence, warmth, affective agility, are all increasingly prized. As these become required, the recognition of these qualities formerly understood not only as temperament or personality, but as quintessentially feminine, are now quite appropriately understood as skills with real value in the marketplace. Shouldn't this be cause for feminist optimism? I mean that in a real sense. It's being valued. We get paid for it, or some people get paid for it. With the global and exponential growth of the service economy has been the hope that the recognition that these skills associated with affective labor were becoming both formally recognized and upwardly mobile. As part of this mobility, these skills might become increasingly valorized, and as such, femininity might cease to be undervalued. If affective labor is critical to the advancement of the new economic spheres, and in Euro-American contexts and many other contexts as well, the work of affect has been associated with women, one logic would have suggested that femininity held aspirational possibility. What a potent moment for anthropological scholarship on capitalism and labor. Remarkably, however, we are back to some of the same patterns of academic valuation in which what counts as theory, unhinged from the specificity of place, time, culture, and history, get valorized, and the corpus of work from C. Wright Mills and Arlie Hochschild and the numerous anthropologists that we've all read, Rachel Pereñas and Elizabeth Wilson, I mean, lots and lots of folks who have worked in all of these spheres I've just described, to the, to the many other feminist ethnographies that forged rich theoretical knowledge about affect as a form of labor, an embodied state, as a mode of intimacy and a full spectrum of felt life became mostly consigned to the apt illustration bundle of ethnographic case material. Perhaps even more troubling, though, is that at the very moment when these forms of labor are sought and valued in the capitalist marketplace at the highest levels, they are purported both by HR executives and call center workers, male and female alike, and by anthropologists and social critics alike, to be unhinged from gender. We are accustomed to the feminization process such that professions like teaching lost their status and their value when women entered the field. Here we are witnessing a process in reverse direction, when feminine qualities rise in the status hierarchy of the capitalist marketplace, including the academic marketplace, and as such must become, if not masculinized, at least ungendered, neutered, for to value femininity is apparently a contradiction in terms.
Odd angle here.
Do you want to switch places, Lucinda? Do you want to switch places with me?
Maybe that's easier. Thank you, Carla.
Sure, no problem.
I want to echo my colleagues' gratitude to the organizers, Joanna and Carla, for this extraordinary opportunity. I feel incredibly honored and humbled to be in such illustrious company. I won't say luminaries, but I'm loving how many echoes there are among these papers, comments. I was raised by a mother who hurled insults at the television when advertisements for feminine hygiene products came on. This is to say, I've been thinking with and through feminism and its capacity to disrupt everyday disciplines of gender since I was a child. I came to anthropology late, taking my first course in my 30s after over a decade of working as a community activist, educator, and organizer for economic and racial justice, sexuality rights, and against violence. More than any of the other fields I've been trained in, literature and literary analysis, religious studies, and South Asia studies, anthropology has equipped me to grapple with sex, gender, as an object, mode, and medium of study. But this brings me to a paradox, which has been mentioned already. As foundational as feminist anthropology has been to feminist thought more broadly, it remains at the margins of anthropological discourse. I never experienced this more powerfully than as a graduate student in a circa 1998 pro-seminar. Feminist anthropology was sequestered into 1 week on the syllabus, and every time I attempted to introduce gender or sexuality as objects or analytics into the conversation, they quietly slipped off the table while the talk moved on to seemingly more consequential matters: colonialism, infrastructure, political economy, religion, sovereignty, subjectivity, social suffering, or the state. Of course, as we know, relations of gender and sex are making all of these domains of life, just as these domains are making sexuality and gender. But not all anthropologists think about it this way, yet. In what follows, I sketch what I see as 3 key terrains of work in the field of feminist anthropology, that is recent work. Though there are long trajectories, you will quickly notice. Denaturalization, critique, and worlding. This, of course, is only one possible map. We could all make a different map. And moreover, I do not see these terrains in any way as mutually exclusive. I offer 1 or 2 examples of recent work in each terrain as an invitation to consider where the field is going. I then turn to the question of how to move theorizations of gender and sexuality, to borrow a phrase from Bell Hooks, from the margin to the center of the discipline. Throughout, I'm trying to attend to the idea that, in the words of Donna Haraway, and this is a quote, "It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories." Denaturalization. Since Sherry Ortner's classic essay, Are Women as to Nature as Men Are to Culture, feminist anthropologists have been working with and against this binary pairing and its implications for how social relations, biological processes, enactments, and inhabitations of gender and cultures of power and knowledge might be thought. In particular, work on reproductive technologies has, in the word of Elizabeth Roberts, disrupted Euro-American certainties about the holism of nature and the artificiality of technology. Here, I'm thinking of the work of Sarah Franklin, Michelle Murphy, Rayna Rapp, and Karis Thompson, among many, many others. Within this terrain, there has been a recent turn to hormones. For instance, forthcoming work by Rebecca Jordan-Young and Katrina Karkazis on testosterone entitled T, the Unauthorized Biography, tracks the diverse physical capacities and rich social life of the, quote, male sex hormone. One of the two winners of this year's Michel Rosaldo Prize, Plastic Bodies, Sex Hormones, and Menstrual Suppression in Brazil, by Emilia Sanabria, stakes its interventions within this terrain. Sanabria's rich ethnography of the discourses and practices facilitating and flowing along with hormones in Baha'i Brazil demonstrates what she elaborates as the plasticity of bodies. In her account, bodies are pharmacologically refashioned and extended into new kinds of medical and social relations through formal and informal ingestion of hormones. Hormones trouble sex gender both as a particular mattering forth of the body and as a relation of binary opposition. Hormones are sexed, but their flows and effects cannot be mapped on a dichotomous chart dividing male from female, men from women. Sanabria engages questions of long-standing interest in the field, including menstrual taboos, bodies as composites of relations, and cultural configurations of sex and gender. At the same time, she calls for a shift away from ambivalence over medically assisted practices of bodily transformation. That is, either its innovation or its toxicity, and we're ambivalent about it, towards what she frames as matters of care, which, drawing on Donna Haraway, she situates as a way of embracing the impure and dirty nature of composite and leaky bodily being. What story is telling this story of denaturalization? From early critiques of technological man inscribing his future on the passive bodies of would-be natural women, to ambivalent narratives of double-edged effects of prosthetically extended embodiment, we have seemed to have come to a compassionate embrace of the always already broken and miscegenated bodies under repair. The subject-object relations in this nature, women, nature, culture, have been corrupted, the quest for purity abandoned. Hormones make worlds through us, and we through them. Critique. Here I'm thinking of work which takes the production of the woman question itself as the object of analysis. To put it slightly differently, that work which is not only feminist anthropology, but also the anthropology of feminism. Much of this work has been conceived at the busy intersection of critical race, Marxist, post-colonial, and feminist theory, and it has taken its aim at Enlightenment rationality, liberal sensibilities, and projects of emancipation. The Twilight of Cutting, African Activism and Life After NGOs by Saida Hocic was awarded the 2017 Rosaldo Prize. It takes cutting, not cutting, but the problematization of cutting as its ethnographic object, and traces the entanglement of anthropological forms of knowledge and liberal forms of governance in the discourses and practices circulating cutting and its ends in Ghana. Hocic calls into question the two main responses to cutting posed by feminist anthropologists. One, cutting must be understood within its own cultural logics, which we can elucidate. Or two, the means and ends of cutting must be decided by African women. Hands off. Both responses let anthropology off the hook, she suggests, by setting it outside the production of cutting as a problem. For Hodgich, the critical potential of feminist anthropology unfolds from a paradox. The possibility of ethical relation lies in the critique of liberal forms of knowledge and governance, the very cradle of feminism. Here we see the anthropologist as critic, not so much speaking truth to power, but speaking with a forked tongue from a place of ethical murk, within which complicity is embraced as a condition of our research and writing. Worlding. In a recent ethnography of the gendered politics of public space in Mumbai, entitled Why Loiter, Shilpa Patke invites the reader to dream of streets full of women eating, laughing, talking, and strolling. Deborah Gordon gestures towards a similar point about the capacity of feminist anthropology to reconceive the boundaries of the possible when she celebrates the contributions radical women of color writing has made to the field. As Gordon notes, Gloria Anzaldúa called for books that have the radical potential to change and expand social realities. The books I am thinking of here focus on activism, projects of social change and cultural innovation, and the vernacular epistemologies and ontologies. These projects are also working in the busy intersection of critical race, Marxist, post-colonial, and feminist theory, and more often include questions of religion, but with a different impulse. They aim not only to shift the analytic repertoire of the reader in the mode of critique, but also her imagination, her ability to incubate and thereby generate worlds otherwise. Among recent monographs, I draw your attention to Jennifer Gott's feminist activist ethnography, Black Autonomy, Race, Gender, and Afro-Nicaraguan Activism. It exemplifies this impulse. Gott documents the place of vernacular culture in the production and reproduction of resistance and survival among Afro-descendants on Nicaragua's Atlantic coast. Methodologically innovative, her often collaborative, always rigorous modes of inquiry make for a richly layered account of the everyday arts and politics of community resilience in the face of formidable, life-threatening state and corporate forces. She argues persuasively for the value of feminist methods broadly for activist anthropology, even when gender per se is not under study, as well as for the need to put the resources of anthropology in service of local projects of emancipation. As you may have guessed, I am worrying some here about the limits of critique without worlding, what Eve Sedgwick described as paranoid reading in the absence of reparative reading, the risks of recapitulating the heroic or imperial narratives of ourselves as able to see what others cannot. I began my remarks with a gesture toward my early lessons in feminist critique. Laile Ameria's book, Downwardly Global, Women, Work, and Citizenship in Pakistani Diaspora, in which she elaborates what she calls the sanitized sensorium that situates immigrants as smelly, taught me to see the whiteness of my mother's pedagogy, the complicity of her own ground of critique. In closing, I want to draw your attention to a recent book that exemplifies the possibility of centering feminist analytics within anthropology. This is something that Inderpal in particular gestured to. I'm very excited for her work. I think is also going to be doing this new book. In Religious Difference in a Secular Aid, a Minority Report, Saba Mahmood tracks the emergence of the constitutive components of political secularism. Political and civil rights, religious liberty, minority rights, public order, and the legal distinction between public and private modern state. Detailing and demonstrating the ways that the plight of religious minorities in Egypt has been exacerbated through them. Working against the idea that a more robust secular state would resolve the plight of religious minorities in the Middle East, she offers a diagnosis of the present that calls for sustained attention to the paradoxical effects of political secularism. A mode of the liberal modern state that, in her account, has unfolded differently in particular contexts, but that everywhere combines the promise of religious liberty with the exacerbation of religious difference and minoritization. The book offers a persuasive exposition of the critical place of sexuality and gender in the constitution of political secularism. As she points out, the family has rarely been seen by scholars of secularism as a necessary unit of political secularism. Her exposition of the gendered effects of the shift of religious authority away from civil and political affairs and into the newly demarcated space of family and sexual relations through regimes of, quote, family law, constitute a major corrective to gender-naive accounts of secularism, and more broadly, to the myopia of anthropology without feminism.
Hi, everyone. Are you awake? You're good? It's an intellectual marathon. Take care of yourselves. Pace yourselves. So thank you all for having me here. When I got the email, I was like, are you sure? Really? Okay. Because, you know, these are big-time people here. So, yes, we got an email with some very serious questions, and I was like, these are books right here. So the questions made me think about, how did I come to feminist anthropology? Like, how did I get here? I thought back deeply, and the first kind of introduction to women in anthropology, I will say, maybe not feminist, but women in anthropology, was Lee Baker. I was trained at Duke University, and in Lee's African American intellectual history course, I, of course, read the Zora Neale Hurston for the first time. And I was like, who is this, and where can I get more of this? And I joke that usually when I run into Black women anthropologists, I'm always like, when did you fall in love with Zora? And they always have a story. So, you know, she's kind of the introduction to feminist anthropology that I got from Lee, who probably wouldn't consider himself a feminist, but definitely over our almost 20 years of a mentoring relationship has practiced feminist politics, right? And so has made me, him and John Jackson in particular, really made me consider what is the role of men practicing feminist politics within feminist anthropology as like not only theory, but in practice, like here in this space. And then my deeper kind of introduction to feminist anthropology was Deborah Thomas, anthropologist, and Tina Campt, historian, co-taught a course on diasporic hegemonies when I was in grad school at Duke, where I was introduced to the great work of these two right here. And what I learned in that course was, it was amazing. I had been at Duke for a long time. There were very vibrant kind of feminist theorists and feminist studies happening on campus. But it was the first time that I had been introduced to Black feminist anthropology and transnational feminisms and thinking about different power dynamics within the African diaspora through racialized and gendered lenses. And it was like, where was this before? And so through a historian, Tina Campt, Lee Baker, who is a historian of the concept of race in anthropology. So he's an anthropologist who does history. And then Deborah Thomas, who's an anthropologist. For me, feminist anthropology has always been introduced to me and practiced in a very interdisciplinary way. So it's always been in conversation with Caribbean studies, other Black feminisms, Africana studies, history, transnational feminisms, and of course anthropology. So there's a possibility here. There's several possibilities here for multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work in the lens of feminist anthropology. So what do I use feminist anthropology for? It was like me and Carla were having this conversation in my head, because they're going to hear some serious echoes here. The research question, or the question that usually stitches together my service, my research, and my teaching is, how do Black people maintain emotional wellness and sanity in the context of racism and sexism? That is what my life's work will always be about. And so affect, emotion, feeling is something that for me, feminist anthropology allows me to really interrogate. Now, I always make the argument, I've been really confused and maybe rageful and upset in the past maybe 2 decades with this kind of frenzy around affect studies, because for me, I'm like, you know, Black people have been writing about affect for forever. Like, why are we acting like this is a new thing? You know, if you look at poetry, if you look at some early social sciences, if you look at early feminist theory, affect is present and there and being theorized. But okay, we're in a new moment. So seeing affect as a data point, understanding affect as a valid form of knowledge, understanding that when one experiences rage, anger, joy, sadness, that is a moment where you can hold on to something and stop and say, what am I learning about power in this moment? What am I learning about capitalism in this moment, right? Affect as a valid source of knowledge is part of what feminist anthropology allows me to do, and how I get it validated by the institutions that are educational that want to hear like valid research on it. Feminist anthropology helps with that, which is connected to this understanding of personal narrative and experiences as theoretical, right? So this is a conversation around, you articulated much more calmly the anger that I had when I read that quote from Maurice Bloch. But thinking about personal narrative and experience as theoretical, as case studies of power. Ethnography is why I'm in this discipline. I will tell you that. When I talk to my undergrads and grad students about choosing why they're going to grad school, which discipline they're going to grad school for, I usually hit our cousin sociology. And I say, choose a discipline that has a methodology and a form and multiple methods that you believe in, right? And for me, I believe in ethnography. I believe that it is a useful place and site for not only getting the very gendered textures of everyday life, but the theory, how we actually make sense and meaning of the world we're living in, and how we understand the different forms of power that are influencing our experiences in the world. Also, experimental forms of not only methodology, but of writing. So Ruth Behar, Gina Ulisse, this is also why I'm here in this discipline, Elise Waterston, folks who are using feminist anthropology to really push our very narrow understandings of not only what ethnography is, but how we present it, how we produce it as a product, how we use it as a teaching tool, how it is represented in written text is part of what I think is exciting and dynamic about feminist ethnography. We've heard a lot of conversation about intersectionality. That's also what I use feminist anthropology for. It's not understand how multiple identities are important to the work we do, but interlocking systems of power and how that they influence the ways that Black women negotiate the world institutionally, structurally, interpersonally, and emotionally. I study happiness. And the only way you're going to understand Black women and happiness together is to have an analysis of the individual, the psychological, the interpersonal, the structural, and institutional, which Africana studies and Black feminist anthropology in particular allow me to do. I was sitting here when we first got in the room kind of laughing because the ABA the Association for Black Anthropologists business meeting was in this room yesterday. And when I think about unfinished work, I look at this room now, and I know that in that room yesterday, it was packed. It was completely full. And about 85% of the room were full of those who have trained me, and they were Black women. Faye Harrison, Irma McLaren, Gina Ulisse, Deborah Thomas, Leith Mullings, Zanayne Davis, all these folks. And I look around the room now, and what do you see? There is something happening. And when I'm running from the ABA exec board to the AFA exec board, which I'm always doing, whenever I come to AAA, I often feel like there are parts of myself that are being disconnected and kept attached from one another, right? And so for someone who was brought into feminist anthropology through a Black feminist anthropology tradition, and I know that they're here and they're very present, and they make me oftentimes think about the ways that mentoring is theoretical, right? That mentoring results in collaborative theoretical work, that mentoring and those generational passing on of knowledge is what shifts the theory in our field, that shifts how we begin to think about things. The erasure of Black feminist anthropology, the need to cite Black women in anthropology more broadly and other disciplines is really important. Lynn Bowles has a great article in Transforming Anthropology where she does a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the lack of citation of Black women in this discipline, and that actually it's outside of this discipline that Black women anthropologists are more cited in. That says a lot about not only our theoretical work, but like in practice, the work that we have to do. The question of marginality, and I appreciate that people have also talked about that. Jonathan Rosa had a comment yesterday at the Do Brown and Black Lives Matter to Anthropology panel, and I wasn't there because I was on another panel, but I read all the tweets. And his question was basically something like, we should really consider whether marginalization is necessarily bad. Like, why do we want to be a part of the thing that we are working so hard to critique, right? And I guess I want to lift that question up. Like, what does our integration in anthropology as feminist anthropologists actually do for us? If we are to become a part of mainstream anthropology, what would that mean that we have to lose? Because we know if we look at the process of becoming American, for example, we know that many times when people become American, they're losing something, right? So what is it that we would have to lose to become part of what is mainstream anthropology? Or is it possible for mainstream anthropology to actually do the work that feminist anthropologists are asking it to do? And the last thing I would say, so we can get on to kind of the conversation, is I organized a panel titled Until We All Are Free, Black Feminist Leadership and Organizing in a Movement for Black Lives yesterday. And I brought some of the women who organize in Black Lives Matter DC here to this space so they could teach us, because we're in DC and we should be able to, part of being feminist for me is to see people, make them visible, and recognize them for who they want to be recognized as, right? I see you, I feel you, I recognize you. And so I wanted us to be in a space where people from DC can talk to us about what we should be doing here. And part of what was interesting was Elle Hearns, who is a very prominent Black trans women organizer, who's the director of the Marsha P. Johnson Institute, said, when you asked me to come talk about Black feminism, I kind of stepped back. Because for me, Black feminisms and thinking about anthropology and Black feminisms, it's a very hegemonic space where cisgender women do a lot of harm and violence to folks like me. And as I, again, looked at the demographics of this conference, compared it to other conferences like NWSA, or thinking about the academy more broadly, how does our feminist work, how do cis women who are feminists erase trans women, not only their experiences, but the theorization, the ways they can push us in our analysis of power, in our analysis of positionality, in our analysis of capitalism and exploitation and labor, right? How can they push us in that? I look forward to lots of work that's coming up by anthropologists that are pushing us to kind of complete some of this unfinished work. Ashante Reese at Spelman is doing work on food and justice, food which oftentimes gets gendered as women's stuff, and doing amazing work around that. Savannah Shangay, who's doing work on color blindness and diversity work in high schools and how they oftentimes are used to do white supremacist work. Diversity work is also seen as gendered, as soft, and that extra work that we do in educational institutions. Kristen Smith doing work on violence in Brazil and thinking about the ways that the state actually targets Black mothers as they are killing their sons, right? So that thinking about violence as a form of slow death and the trauma that happens from the state when the state doesn't by accident affect these Black mothers, but Black women and mothers strategically being sought out for violence through this killing of their sons. And Maya Berry, who just walked out, and Sarah Mood, and a group of folks, a group of women of color who went to UT Austin, who were trained, who are asking us to really take seriously the ways that sexual violence and sexual harassment in the field is affecting how we train our students, how they see themselves and think about themselves as anthropologists as they engage in field work, how it has long-term effects for the way that we consider ourselves scholars. And thinking about and asking us to think about a fugitive anthropology. That article is in Cultural Anthropology this month, so you should check it out. We really have some, I mean, again, I'm here because I love being a feminist anthropologist. Anthropology is my beloved discipline. I'm trained in many disciplines, but this is where I belong. I refuse to leave. A lot of us Black women anthropologists and Black feminist anthropologists talk about the ways that our work is not often seen as legible in this discipline. When we go on the market, we are seen as doing some other type of work, and we are pushed out into ethnic studies, Africana studies, women and gender studies. But this is my discipline, and I refuse to leave. So you will hear me. You will hear me continue to be here. But I say that, saying that, you know, with all the critique that I just threw at all of us, there's so much joy and so much possibility here. And I thank all of the senior folks and elders who made room for us to even have these conversations, because I think we're pushing further. And I'm really excited about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. We could spend the next, the rest of this conference and into next one unpacking a lot of this and having conversations, and there's no way that we can pick up on all of this, but what I'd like to do is offer one question for now. Carla might have a question in there, and then I also want to invite any of you to ask each other questions, because at this point we're turning it into discussion, so please pick up on any of the things that you saw as threads and push each other on any of these points. And we're going to do that for, I'd say the next 10-15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience and a more participatory discussion. So one thing that I wanted to pick up on is one of the threads that I saw cutting through all of the presentations had to do with a mixture of citation practices, the canon, gendered hierarchies of knowledge and academic production, what Inderpal called male ancestor worship. And I wanted to ask a question based on, many of you have very usefully called our attention to recent contributions, right, to new critical areas of feminist inquiry, and Bianca and Rayna and Lucinda most explicitly, gave us lovely long lists. So we all have, lots of great new reading to do. But I wanted to pick up on one of the questions that Carla was asking about, who do we assign, and whether that's sort of an opportunity to rethink, and I'm so glad some of you took the bait on the Maurice Bloch quote, rethink, what counts as our canon, and the work that we need to do in terms of our own intellectual history of feminist anthropology and of anthropology more broadly. So you've all contributed enormously to our thinking forward, to what's next, and to what's out there now that we can start to kind of wrap our hands around. I wonder whether each of you could comment on how you would redo the canon. And that is in a feminist anthropology course, and taking Lucinda's comment about, the 1 week of feminist anthropology in the seminar, right, of general anthropology, the general anthropology course, right? And I'm thinking here especially of, in preparing for this roundtable, I did, many of us teach feminist anthropology classes. I did a quick kind of survey of the syllabi available to all of us on that, and there's a pretty common core of texts, really wonderful texts. All of you have written them, and they're all on there. And I wonder, though, whether there's also an opportunity to rethink that, going further back. I'm thinking of Andrew Banks' recent work on pioneers of the field in South African feminist anthropology, in which he is valorizing the ethnography part, right, of this, in Maurice Bloch's distinction of saying these are really our pioneers in making anthropology as a field. And so who do you think is missing from the earlier side that we should put both in the feminist anthropology canon and in the general what is anthropology canon? So that's my question, and then Carla, and then you.
Whoever teaches feminist anthropology should go. I don't teach it.
Rayna.
I don't teach feminist anthropology.
So do it for.
Okay,
how would you
so
do
I
it?
have had the privilege for the last couple of years of team teaching with Sally Mary. We took over the social theory and practice basic social theory at the graduate level. And for every part of the canon, we have simply added critiques from people who are themselves either struggling around gender and Weber or Marx or Durkheim, or colonialism, anti-colonialist struggle and the British social anthropology tradition, or on and on and on. I mean, we have found, and we have made it our business to find those critiques, and some are much more durable over the long haul than others. Some are written in the heat of the moment in the 1970s or 80s or 90s as a way to say, looky here, this is an exclusionary set of practices you've been involved in. But it seems to us very important that as you read your basic male ancestor worship, you also read the critiques at the same time, because you can't get a job in the field if you don't know who, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim are, but you should also know who the critiques of their concepts are and where those critiques come from erased positions and voices. So that's the way we've redesigned a syllabus.
I'll say something about experiment and experimental method. And so there's a wonderful resource many of you may be familiar with called Women Writing Culture, which is a kind of riposte to the writing culture and the infamous claim that Clifford's claim that the exclusion of feminist anthropology was because they just really weren't experimenting. And the fantastic work that volume does is that it charts the long history of very radical, brilliant experiments in ethnography written by women. And of course, one of the luminaries in that cast of characters is definitely Zora Neale Hurston, who continues not to be taught in most anthropology departments at all. Most students, if they encounter her in literature classes. Yes. I had the extraordinary opportunity to teach a cohort of undergrad from Cornell and Adivasi youth in the Nilgiri Hills in South India in a study abroad encounter program. It's a bilingual classroom in English and Tamil. And I had 1 week to teach them ethnographic methods. And I taught Horace Miner's The Rituals of the Narasimha, which is, as many of you may be familiar, is, this fantastic, rich description of the weird rituals we perform in front of the, as he calls it, the sacred bundle, medicine, whatever. And, we put the disgusting bundle of hog bristles in our mouth. Anyways, it's fantastic defamiliarization of an American practice. And then I taught the first chapter of Mules and Men. Because, here it's a field school, I'm trying to prepare these students to go, these Adivasi youth to go back into their own communities in research teams and do ethnographic work. And so the brilliance of her, the epistemological moves she makes about what it is to be both an insider and an outsider, I thought just like there was just no other better way to frame the potential, the critical potential that they had far away and above what the Cornell students could bring to the. So that's just one small example.
I don't teach feminist anthropology, but I do teach feminist post-colonial theory quite regularly. And I do teach anthropologists, and so I teach generally Karen Hope because the kind of culture of excellence and brilliance and finance capital is central. I feel I teach Deb Thomas to think about violence and race and kind of post-coloniality. and transnationalism, the kind of production of violence across spaces. I teach Vina Das, thinking of attentiveness to words and language, and logics of empowerment. I think those are the kind of works I've been teaching recently. As a work that brought back Maria Mai's Patriarchy and Accumulation on the World Scale. It was really great to teach that, to think about it again in a point at which I'm trying to think through what is it about the kind of theorization of patriarchy we need to rethink and to re-examine, and what kinds of work in anthropology and elsewhere we need to bring back, because and to move away from the kind of essentializing sort of heteronormative structure of patriarchy that has emerged and been critiqued usefully, but to think, where else can we go with it? How can we think about it in relation to oligarchies, for instance, authoritarian power, etc. So I want to think, so Maria Mai's and generally about patriarchy.
I've been a dean for the last few years, and I have done no teaching. But my feminist anthro course and my globalization classes are my two favorite courses. And I did a kind of, what should I say, deceptive move with my globalization teaching. When I first entered the profession, I taught a graduate seminar at UNC Chapel Hill in 1993. I think Carla Jones was in that class. And I tried to teach an undergraduate version of it, and I called it Gender and Globalization. And I had only women in the undergraduate class. And so I learned very quickly to not do that. And I only call my course Globalization. And I get lots of young men in there, and I get people, actually it's interesting because there's a lot of diversity along every possible line. And I assign feminist ethnographies throughout. And so they get exposed to work, and they don't know any better. And so they think that's the canon. So I feel really excited by that. And like Inderpal, I assigned, actually in one version, I assigned Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, which is a brilliant early book. And no one cites it anymore. Nobody reads it anymore. I put that in the same category actually as Arlie Hochschild's Managed Heart. If you're working on affective labor, as so many of us are, or affect itself, people cite Michael Hart, that one little essay he wrote. And it really annoys me. And not that he's not great. I mean, his work is really great, but it really deeply upsets me, because this is the citation pattern we're talking about. And it has material effect. It really does. And Hochschild's work is really sophisticated and really complicated and smart. And there are wonderful critiques. Kathy Weeks does a brilliant discussion of it in The Problem with Work. So is that the title? I hope I got that right. Is that right? Okay. Really phenomenal book. So I guess I like bringing back some of the tattered old books that students are not exposed to, although they've seen one or two references to, and sometimes are inclined to cite the concept, but really haven't read the original. So, and I can think of lots of examples of kind of under-recognized early works that I think of as classics. I mean, I still used to assign, Margaret Mead and insist that students actually read the original in order to critique, before they race to the critique, like that they've actually read something. So I guess that's my little.
Can I say one thing? I don't have any text to add. They're the experts. But I just wanted to reemphasize this point that you're making about teaching in the classroom, because, again, I think at the time that I was trained at Duke, Lee Baker, John Jackson, and Deborah Thomas were in one department, and it was the second highest amount of Black anthropologists in one department in the country. And what that did was, as I was trained on a particular genealogy, of anthro. And then I assumed that everyone was trained with the same text that I had. And then I got here to my first AAA and was like, what is happening? And I mean, the same thing around my training around transnational feminisms and African diaspora work. And so I think for me, the important lesson was train your students in the way that you would hope them to be trained, and then let them come here and let this be the outlier. Right? Like, don't let your classroom be the outlier. Let them come here and be like, I don't know what's happening at AAA, but they're missing a whole... That's the experience that they should have, right? And so what we assign on the syllabus and what we discuss in our departments and who we decide to invite to give talks and all those things matter because it's a way to shift this major gathering that's here, you know, and instead of us feeling like the marginalized spaces or people, then come here and there would be a wave of like, what is happening? AAA is kind of behind in what is happening in our classrooms, right?
I'll just make one last shout out to another book that has just come out, which is really amazing, Prairie Rising. If you've heard about Prairie Rising, Jessica and Dylan. It's an astonishing book about Saskatchewan in Canada and the policing and criminalization of Indigenous youth and looking at the Canadian state and its ways of managing Indigenous youth in places, in areas and regions that they own as their own land, but they're dispossessed from it. It's a great book. So I just want to shout out that book.
There's a hand back there.
Yes.
I want to make a quick pitch in terms of reading for the Combahee River Collective statement as a required reading. I went back and reread it, and it's all there. We all owe a huge debt. It's the 40th anniversary of that statement, and it's very, very powerful. It's a really early, important articulation of intersectionality.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do any of you have questions for each other?
I think we're ready.
To the field.
There's a whole room of...
I just follow up on this question about marginalization that that's come up in a couple of different moments. And I think one interesting way to think about it rather than us being marginal or feeling marginal is that I want everybody who's trained in anthropology to learn that you have to think with sex and gender. Which is not about feeling, that's about feeling like, no, you can't properly understand the state. You can't properly understand infrastructure. You can't properly analyze, any religious Trump. I mean, it's just screaming at us, right? Yeah. But they're not hearing it. So that's the move I was trying to make.
Yeah.
A person in the yellow back there had a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Could you stand up? Thank you.
I just found a new book about the River Collective called How We Get Free, and it has new commentaries by all the original.
Wow.
Oh, that's wow. Fantastic. Thank you. Great.
It's been selling out, so in Chicago. Haywood Market is the publisher.
Any other questions?
Wow. Just like come to sleep, I guess.
You answered everything.
Seriously, no challenges?
So this is for the last speaker. I was interested to hear you mention trans women because I think this is actually a really live debate in feminism, and I think it's one of the ways that it's one of the ways by which radical feminism is again sort of being pushed into the past as something that we don't need. Because there's a really strong radical feminist critique of trans ideology, and trans ideology is one of the ways that feminist voices are currently being censored. So there's the new platform of women like Julie Bindel, Linda Bellows. Julie Bindel has been a really powerful feminist lesbian activist in the UK. Linda Bellows is a feminist activist of color in the UK. So I just wonder if anybody in anthropology is paying attention to this. I think that the sort of rhetorical invocation of cis women are oppressing trans women, I'd really like to challenge that. I'm wondering, am I the only person in the room who thinks that? Or is there anyone else who thinks that something has really been lost in the denunciation of radical feminism and kind of the ignoring of the radical feminist critique of trans activism and trans ideology? Can anyone up there speak to that?
So I guess one reason why I mentioned that is because so I've been an organizer for a while, mostly in academic spaces, and then post the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, just felt like that wasn't enough, and so I had to go figure out where I could go to do something else. And so organizing in a movement for Black Lives, which is a movement that centers Black women, queer folks, trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, what has been fascinating to me is there's a very rigorous interrogation of feminisms in that space that in some way I feel like the Academy is missing. Like, we're missing out on it. And it's not just like theory, like read this and then speak back to me. It's how are we creating community? How are we doing decision making? How are we creating internal structure? How do we plan actions in ways that are feminist practices? And I have, as a cisgender, Black, heterosexual woman, am constantly running into my brick wall of oppression, constantly running into the space where I'm like, oh, I didn't see that thing that I did or that thing that I said is really oppressive in that space. And I guess what folks have been calling for is not an essentialist practice where we just replace cisgender women with trans women or trans folk. It's really to take the analysis around patriarchy, the analysis around transphobia, these systems of power, and understand our different positionalities in it, and that as cisgender women, we do have power and privilege in that particular space. And as a Black woman that, experiences racism, experiences anti-Blackness, came from a working class family, there's all the ways I want to hold on and be like, no, what do you mean? I'm one of the good people. We're oppressed together. But constantly running into the ways I'm like, oh, I get it. And I guess maybe we need to get in a room to have conversations about it, but I guess what I have to say is the same way that I ask that white folks listen and take my experiences as valid and my analysis, my experiential knowledge, my affect as a data point to understand white supremacy and how they are privileged and empowered in it, then I as a cisgender woman have to listen to the ways that Black trans women are telling me over and over again that you all are hurting us, not only interpersonally, but structurally and institutionally. And I can feel all types of ways about it, and I can maybe have some critiques for it, but at the end of the day, if we're focusing on power and not just identities and subjectivities, that there has to be something there that there's work for me to do on that.
Can I?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the difficult aspects of teaching and working around feminism has been the struggle against not producing totalizing versions of feminism, right? That you have to, and back to the teaching, that you have to teach feminist anthropology or theory or whatever, a set of contestations and debates. And those are intrinsic and vital to the field, and that challenges and limits emerge, and that you have to think about them, but also not to think about categories of radical feminism or feminism itself as fixed or stable in some kind of way, that they're always changing. And even when we retrospectively think of what that is, we may not see the entire sense of what radical feminism was at that time. So I'm always sort of trying to think through what are the debates and how we think of the past. So just an example of radical feminism, I always teach Valerie Solana's and Scum Manifesto, but it's interesting to teach that in a complicated way, to think about how it resonates in this moment in time and how we can work through that text to think about both the kind of complex critique that Solana's lays out, which is simply more than just, cutting up men, but it's a deep critique of political economy within that manifesto. So it's always interesting to kind of think about memory and reworking and recursive teaching, but also to think about debates and dissenting voices within.
Thank you very much. I'm from the Netherlands, from Europe, and last week I was attending a network meeting of the Network for the Anthropology of Gender and Sexuality. It's part of the EASA, the European Association for Social Anthropology. And we were planning on organizing a panel at the EASA conference next year in Stockholm, I think, on the feminist anthropology. And I just wanted to say that this panel has been so inspiring for me, and I will take everything I've heard today to that meeting, so that also in that conference we will discuss the same questions. And I think especially in Europe, what could be emphasized more is Black feminist anthropology, as I think that's somehow more missing from the debate in anthropology, but also in feminist anthropology there. So I really hope the video will be available as well, but I was just wanted to thank you and to tell you that I take this experience back to the other side of the table.
Since Europe has come into the room, I'll just mention one other book that I've been reading that's really incredible, which is by Marilyn Strathern, who is another luminary who hasn't come into the conversation yet. And it's a book that she wrote almost 40 years ago called Before and After Gender. That's was just published last year. And it's really fantastic. And one of the points that she makes in characteristically Strathernian style is that gender is a relation with which we make relations. And that one of the things that makes it so difficult to study gender, by which she also means sex, and we just let that be that problem for the moment, is because it's both itself and it's also making other things at the same time. And so tracking both of those moves that gender makes is actually an incredibly complex analytic endeavor. So anyway, I recommend it highly.
We do have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes.
I want to thank you all for your thoughts. It's really inspiring to me too. I'm a historian, and I write mainly on women's labor. And I guess the question that I've gone to most of the sessions of this subset, and I haven't heard much about labor of women. And I wondered if anybody would like to comment on it, because I'm missing this.
Carla.
How much time do we have?
You've got 2 minutes.
Somewhere we couldn't hear it.
Sure.
The question was about labor and whether anybody would like to comment on the women's labor in the aspect of this. So we're turning it over to Carla.
I'm honestly not exactly sure what to say succinctly. I think, as we all know, certain analytical, I've always been interested in gatekeeping concepts. Why certain parts of the world get fixated on certain puzzles, certain questions, why certain moments in history generate a preoccupation with certain kinds of questions and concepts. And labor is out of favor. I think it's as simple as that. And I think there are a lot of people working on labor. It's not to say that I'm one of them. It means everything to me. I had lunch with Lamia Karim earlier today, who's working on garment workers in Bangladesh. There are lots of people working on labor, but somehow the kind of currency it garners at this particular moment is not much. And I think what should we make of that? What's being said about capitalism at this moment? Lots of people are writing about capitalism. They're writing about certain kinds of circulation. They're writing about financial markets. So labor is all part of that, right? It's all, you know, we talk about social reproduction and its integral relationship to the market economy. That's one of our most important feminist chestnuts, right? Lots of people did that. And yet, somehow or another, even as we collectively, anthropology, social science, the academy at large, are concerned about, the tenuous and mutable and fragile precariat, the shape of capitalism today, labor per se is being cast, I guess, in different kinds of ways. And one of them is in this sphere of affect theory. And so I guess part of what has really irked me is that since many of the origins of thinking about affective states are integrally bound up in labor, how does the labor drop out in the theory? Like if you read, and I don't want to cast aspersions on any of this work, but you read Berlant or you read Clough or you read the people who are elevated as the theorists of affect, there's no labor in their discussions at all. In fact, there are very few people in there.
True that.
So anyway, but I'd be happy to talk to you at more length.
One area in which I find it really interesting is to think about the shared economy and the ways in which people are thinking of the production value through the use of labor that is then disavowed.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Really
and there is really interesting work on non-work, on post-work, and where are we going to be when certain industries continue to leave not only the United States, but now they're leaving India for other places, or they're leaving the parts of the world that had attracted labor from the West. You want to?
No, I would just add I just add a citation, which is just to take a look at Melissa Cooper and Catherine Waldaby's book, Clinical Labors, which tries to make a very ambitious neo-Marxist feminist theory about labor that is precarious, that is underpaid, that is 19th century regressive to the idea that the informed consent form of the work people do when they are, whether it's being a kind of surrogate in a developing nation context, or it's doing guinea pig work for a pharmaceutical trial, that all of that is bringing labor back to its 19th century, you take the burden of all the risks, and there's nothing out there except our statement of ethics. So I think that's a place where you could find a lot of really good work on labor. Melissa Cooper and Catherine Waldby, Waldby, Clinical Labor.
I think that part of this discussion is yet another example of, I would say, the siloization of anthropology, because I have a very good friend who's been in the anthropology of work section for a very long time and reads all the books to give the prize, and we talk about it all the time. And in fact, they are talking about the issues that you raised, but they're not here.
Right.
They're in the anthropology of work, or they're in the anthropology of reproduction. So I just hesitate to say that the work is not going on. It's just not represented under feminist anthropology.
No, yeah, absolutely right.
Why though?
I think, unless anyone has a burning question, we're almost at the end of our time. I'd like to just invite the panelists to, if you have any parting thoughts, final words. We have a long reading list, all of us. Any final comments?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, there's a question.
Were the bibliographies that you're giving us, are those available online?
Everything's available, and the video recording for this, if you didn't jot down all of the names will be available ideally on the AFA website eventually, not immediately, but eventually. So
If you're well, the AFA has a syllabus reservoir. There's a tab where you can access. Actually, let me just make one final plug. Here we are. If you are not an AFA member, we are a very reasonable membership, and we need your membership because, as we were saying earlier, every organization gets a certain number of tokens in order to sponsor sessions. And if we don't have a significant membership, we can't sponsor great panels. And we gave up a lot of tokens on this panel. So please help us by joining.
As you can see, we're awesome, so you can
join the organization, and regardless, you can go to our website and access syllabi. I also will say that some of the references that Lucinda made in her remarks are both the recipients and the finalists for the AFA Risaldo Prize this year. So I strongly recommend, if you're on the AFA listserv, you'll get all of these announcements and all of those references. So it's very handy. And we also have an incredible publication of book reviews in the AFA site. And we have an opportunity for any of you who would like to write book reviews of many of these phenomenal books. We have a lengthy list of monographs that are ready to be reviewed. So please go to our website and join the organization. Thank you.
It's always good to end on marching orders.